Thomas Piketty is a French economist who works on wealth and income inequality. He is professor at the École des hautes études en sciences sociales and professor at the Paris School of Economics. He is the author of the best-selling book Capital in the 21st Century, which emphasizes the themes of his work on wealth concentrations and distribution over the past 250 years. The book argues that the rate of capital return in developed countries is persistently greater than the rate of economic growth, and that this will cause wealth inequality to increase in the future. To address this problem, he proposes redistribution through a global tax on wealth. Biography: Piketty was born on May 7, 1971, in the Parisian suburb of Clichy, Hauts-de-Seine. He gained a C-stream baccalaureate copyright at, and after taking scientific preparatory classes, he entered the École Normale Super Copyright RIA at the age of 18, where he studied mathematics and economics. At the age of 22, Piketty was awarded his Ph.D. for a thesis on wealth redistribution, which he wrote at the EHESS and the London School of Economics under Roger Gesnery. After earning his Ph.D., Piketty taught from 1993 to 1995 as an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In 1995, he joined the French National Center for Scientific Research as a researcher, and in 2000 he became professor at EHESS. Piketty won the 2002 prize for the best young economist in France, and according to a list dated November 11, 2003, he is a member of the Scientific Orientation Board of the Association Eurogauche, en Europea, FR, founded by Michel Ricard and Dominique Strauss-Kahn. In 2006 Piketty became the first head of the Paris School of Economics, which he helped set up. He left after a few months to serve as an economic advisor to Socialist Party candidate Czar copyright Golany Royal during the French presidential campaign. Piketty resumed teaching at the EHESS and Paris School of Economics in 2007. He is a columnist for the French newspaper Libre Copyright Ration, and occasionally writes op-eds for Le Monde. In April 2012, Piketty co-authored along with 42 colleagues an open letter in support of the NPS candidate for the French presidency for une section Wa Holland. Holland won the contest against the incumbent Nicolas Sarkozy in May of that year. In 2013, Piketty won the biennial Paragraph Janssen Award, for the economist under age 45 who has made a contribution in theoretical and applied research that is significant to the study of economics in Europe. Research: Piketty specializes in economic inequality, taking a historic and statistical approach. His work looks at the rate of capital accumulation in relation to economic growth over a 200-year spread from the 19th century to the present. His novel use of tax records enabled him to gather data on the very top economic elite, who had previously been understudied, and to ascertain their rate of accumulation of wealth and how this compared to the rest of society and economy. His most recent book, Capital in the 21st Century, relies on economic data going back 250 years to show that an ever-rising concentration of wealth is not self-correcting. To address this problem, he proposes redistribution through a global tax on wealth. Study of long-term economic inequalities, a research project on high incomes in France led to the book Les Hautes Revenus en France ou XXE, which was based on survey of statistical series covering the whole of the 20th century, built from data from the fiscal services. He extended this analysis in his immensely popular book Le Capital or XXIE Survey on the Evolution of Inequalities in France. Piketty's work shows that differences in earnings dropped sharply during the 20th century in France, mostly after World War II. He argues that this was due to a decrease in estate inequalities, while wage inequalities remained stable. The shrinking inequality during this period, Piketty says, resulted from a highly progressive income tax after the war, which upset the dynamics of estate accumulation by reducing the surplus money available for saving by the wealthiest. The normative conclusion Piketty draws is that a tax cut and thus a decrease in the financial contribution to society of the wealthy that has been happening in France since the late 1990s will assist in the rebuilding of the earlier large fortunes of the rentier class. This trend will lead to the rise of what he calls patrimonial capitalism, in which a few families control most of the wealth. Through a statistical survey, Piketty also showed that the Laffer effect, which claims that high marginal tax rates on top incomes are an incentive for the rich to work less, was probably negligible in the case of France. Comparative work. Piketty has done comparative work on inequality in other developed countries. In collaboration with other economists, particularly Emmanuel Says, he built a statistical series based on a similar method used in his studies of France. This research led to reports on the evolution of inequalities in the USA, and on economic dynamics in the English-speaking world and continental Europe. The surveys found that following World War II, after initially undergoing a decrease in economic inequality similar to that in continental Europe, English-speaking countries have, over the past 30 years, experienced increasing inequalities. A critic of the Gzetz curve, Piketty's work has been discussed as a critical continuation of the pioneering work of Simon Gzetz in the 1950s. According to Gzetz, the long-term evolution of earnings inequalities was shaped as a curve. Growth started at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and slackened off later due to the reallocation of the labor force from low-productivity sectors like agriculture to higher productivity sectors like industry. According to Piketty, the tendency observed by Gzetz in the early 1950s is not necessarily a product of deep economic forces. Instead, estate values, rather than wage inequalities, decreased, and they did so for reasons that were not specifically economic. Consequently, the decrease would not necessarily continue, and in fact, inequalities have grown sharply in the US over the last 30 years, returning to their 1930s level. Other work, besides these surveys, which make up the core of his work, Piketty has published in other areas, often with a connection to economic inequalities. His work on schools, for example, postulates that disparities among different schools, especially class sizes, is a cause for the persistence of inequalities in wages and the economy. He has also published proposals for changes in the French pension system and the French tax system. Speaking with labor leaders in the United Kingdom, he stated that tax rates could be raised above 50% for earnings over £1 million without it impacting the economy. Capital in the 21st Century. Capital in the 21st Century, published in 2014, focuses on wealth and income inequality in Europe and the US since the 18th century. The book's central thesis is that inequality is not an accident but rather a feature of capitalism that can be reversed only through state intervention. The book thus argues that unless capitalism is reformed, the very democratic order will be threatened. The book reached number 1 on the New York Times best-selling hardcover non-fiction list dated May 18, 2014. Bibliography, Les hautes revenus faisant modifications des taux marginaux super copyright Ries de la Euro unregistered trademark impetus sur le revenu en France, 1970–1996, Eine Copyright-Gelite Copyright Essay Copyright Economics, Report to the Council of Economic Analysis with Tony Atkinson, Michel Godeta, Fr., and Lucille Ollier, Les hautes revenus en France ou XXA Messiah Claire, Eine Copyright-Gelite Copyright Essay Redistribution, 1901 Euro 1998, Fiscalité Copyright et Redistribution Sociale dans la France du XX Messiah Claire, LA Copyright Economy Designer Copyright-Gelite Copyright S. Vive la gauche Arma Copyright Ricani. Acronics 1998 Euro 2004. Pour un nouveau système de retraite des comptes individuels de cotisations financa copyright S par our copyright partition with Antoine Bozzio, on the long-run evolution of inheritance. France, 1820 Euro 2050, pour une rare copyright volution fiscale with Emmanuel Says and Camille Landis, Put on sauve l'Européen. Chronics 2004 Euro 2012, Le Capital or XXIE Claire, Capital in the 21st Century, see also, Anthony Barnes Atkinson, Criticism of Capitalism, Occupy Movement, References. External links, personal page of Thomas Piketty, The World Top Income Database, YouTube video of Thomas Piketty describing capital in the 21st century, page on the site of Concealed Analyzer Copyright Economique, Eine Copyright-Gelehrte Copyright Essay Redistribution in France en XXICAR, Conference of the Université Copyright Duchesse les Savoirs, 2002, Recherches ra Copyright Sense sur la question des eine Copyright-Gelehrte Copyright S. Thomas Piketty, Croissance et Copyright Économique ra Copyright Partition des Richesses, Thomas Piketty, A Plan for a Working and Democratic Eurozone, Nytimes.com, Taking on Adam Smith April 19, 2014, Nytimes.com, Marx Rises Again April 19, 2014, Watch, Elizabeth Warren and Thomas Piketty discuss nature, causes of economic inequality. The Huffington Post. June 2, 2014.